Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at this mini PC called the B550 from MinisForum. Now I'm pretty excited about this mini PC. I think this is probably the most versatile one that I've ever tested before, because in addition to being a powerful PC in its own right, it has the ability to plug and play various CPUs, and you can also hook up a discrete graphics card as well as its own power supply too. And on top of that, the price point for this is pretty competitive at any of the various use cases that this will actually work with. For example, if you wanted to add your own CPU as well as your own storage and RAM, the price actually starts at $320. Now, the one I'm testing with has the Ryzen 7 5700G with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. And that would make it one of the most powerful standalone mini PCs with integrated graphics. And still, altogether, it comes out to $730. And so, despite not being the most expensive mini PC I reviewed, this is actually the most powerful. So already it's a pretty good deal. Now on top of that, the mini PC comes with its own dock as well. And this will allow you to hook up your own graphics card in case you wanted to bump the specs up even more. Now to do so, you'd have to bring your own power supply as well. But I really appreciate the fact that they have this all kind of pre-built for you so that you can assemble it all yourself. Altogether, it makes the mini PC way more upgradable than any other one I've tested before. And I'm a big fan of this concept because I feel like it makes your PC last that much longer. Altogether, I feel like there are three potential main use cases for this device. First is just the pre-built mini PC that we're going to be testing here today, but also you could put together your own mini PC if you added your own CPU, RAM, and storage. And then to go one step further, you could just make this a straight up upgradable PC. By adding your own power supply and GPU, you could essentially just use this as a mini PC for now, and then later on when you're ready to upgrade, all you'd have to do is add a GPU and power supply. And so in that regard, this PC seems to have longer legs than your typical mini PC you would see on a channel like this. And so we're going to break this up into two videos. The first video, which you're going to watch here, is the one where I'm just going to look at the mini PC itself. I'm going to use the CPU and the RAM and storage that they sent over to me. And then in another video in the future, I'll add a graphics card and a power supply, and we'll see how we can push it to its limits there as well. Either way, we're just going to check out the mini PC as it is right now. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so one unique thing about this device, it comes with its own travel case. We'll take a look at that here in a second. First, let's look at all the accessories that come with it. To start, we have an HDMI cable, and it also comes with cables for the graphics card and power supply when you want to hook that up yourself. Additionally, it has all the screws you're going to need to hook everything up and secure it together. And it also has additional brackets and things like that to kind of assemble everything yourself. It also has a VESA mount if you wanted to hook it up to a monitor, and here's part of that mounting bracket here. And finally, here is the dock. This is where you're going to hook the mini PC up as well as that graphics card. And we'll dive into more detail when I do that second video where we're actually going to use this. But I will say I'm using a prototype right now, and there is going to be a new dock coming out when this actually goes retail in about a month and a half. But for now, we're not going to use it at all. We're just going to focus on the mini PC itself. And so let's get down to business. Here's the case like I was talking about before. It has a hard shell to it, and it looks pretty nice. The device comes with an instruction manual which does walk you through how to do all the installation. And then on the left side here, we have the power supply cable as well as the power supply itself. Now this is a 120 watt power supply here, so it's going to give you plenty of juice for the 5700G, which we'll be using here in this video. But like I said before, if you're going to actually add a graphics card, you're going to need a different power supply than this one. Okay, and then on the other side of this flap here is the actual PC itself. Before we actually tear this apart and look at everything inside, let's go over the specs real quick. Now there are two options when it comes to the CPU if you are going to buy it, but you can also add desktop class 4000 or 5000 series Ryzen CPUs as well. But there are a couple that won't work within that series, so definitely check out the MinisForum page before you go and decide to buy this. Now the chip I'm using in this unit will have integrated Radeon graphics, and it supports DDR4 RAM up to 64 gigs. In terms of storage, you have two M.2 slots, and you can also add a 2.5-inch SATA drive as well. It's got really good connectivity, Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.2, and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet as well. It has support for triple display output, 2 by HDMI and 1 by DisplayPort, all at 4K 60Hz. And then in terms of ports, there are 4 USB 3.2 ports in the back as well as a full-scale USB-C Gen 2. And it ships with Windows 10 Pro, but it also supports Linux. And we'll test that with Batocera later in this video. Okay, now we'll actually unbox the thing and have a look. First thing, the entire shell is covered in aluminum other than the top. The top is made with a hard plastic here. And honestly, it doesn't look bad at all. I like the amount of ventilation we have here. And then this white stripe across the bottom right is actually a blue LED light. On the left, we have some more ventilation as well as where you're going to plug it in into the dock. And then you have even more ventilation on the right as well as your CMOS reset button. Not a lot going on in the front other than this powered by AMD logo here. And then on the back, we have all of the ports. We have the power button, a Kensington lock, the power input, and then the display port, as well as the dual HDMI we mentioned before. And then our 4 USB-A ports, as well as our 1 USB-C port. Additionally, we have audio out and audio in, and then that 2.5 gigahertz LAN. Now the bottom also has some ventilation, and it also has a couple ports here for your graphics card. I really appreciate that this is all easily accessible without having to open up the device itself. There are a couple stickers of warning here, just making sure that you unplug everything before you actually connect your graphics card. But yeah, in terms of I/O and the overall design, that's what it looks like. I think it's a pretty nice looking mini PC here, but I will say it is kind of large when it comes to the mini PCs. Definitely the biggest one I've tested before. And when you combine that with the power supply, it is a lot of space. But I do think that that travel case does make things a little bit easier to handle. Let's do some quick size comparisons. We'll start with the TH50, which is one of my favorite mini PCs of all time, also from MinisForum. And this one's actually at the larger end of the spectrum too, but as you can see, the B550 is still quite larger than this one. Here's another MinisForum PC. This is the UM350. I haven't reviewed this one yet. I was actually working on the review when the B550 showed up. And this one has some lower specs, but is also quite a bit cheaper too. But as you can see, it's almost a whole different category from the B550. This one's just kind of tiny compared to the other. Now that being said, it's not like the B550 is huge. As you can see here, it's just maybe twice the size of an Xbox controller. And so yeah, I think in just general terms of mini PCs, it is quite big. It's probably about 4 Kerrygold butters altogether, but it's still quite small in the grand scheme of things. For example, here is the M1 version of the Mac Mini. And as you can see, the B550 is actually quite a bit smaller in terms of width and length. Now that being said, it is quite a bit thicker than the Mac Mini, but honestly, I like the boxiness of the B550 more than the Mac Mini. To me, the Mac Mini has always kind of felt like a pancake. And so in that regard, yes, probably by mass, the B550 is bigger than the Mac Mini, but to me, it still feels a little bit smaller just by virtue of being taller and a little bit more narrow along the sides. But in the end, I'm probably just kind of nitpicking at this point, because in the end, this is a small and compact mini PC. And as we'll see with the performance here later, it's kind of amazing how much they were able to fit in this little thing. My biggest regret when it comes to the design and the I/O is that it lacks any ports on the front. Okay, let's actually take this thing apart and have a look at the inside. And by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the bottom is also made out of plastic. Only the sides are made out of metal. One thing I really do appreciate about this is that these screws actually stay attached to the device itself, so they're never going to get lost, and that's pretty awesome. Now let's kind of look through the inside here. So on the bottom you can see there is the storage slot as well as the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip here. And this is the MediaTek 7921K, and I've seen this one before. I think it's in the Aya Neo Next and maybe another mini PC that I've reviewed before. Now I do want to check the M.2 because MinisForum is known for using name brand parts. And so by pulling off the heatsink here, yes, you can see they're using a Kingston hard drive, so good on them for that. Now this is a prototype unit, so it may not be like this in the full retail, but in order to remove everything else, it actually just pulls right out. There's no other screws you have to take out. It's just a matter of kind of getting the right angle so you can pull everything out. And so mostly the rest of the device is taken up by a huge heatsink as well as a fan. But also on the right edge here, you can see they have 2 slots of RAM as well. And let's check this one out as well, and yeah, they're using Kingston RAM for this too. And I like the fact that the RAM here is set up like it is on a desktop too, very easy to get in and out. And man, this heatsink is impressive. And by the way, if you don't buy a CPU, you want to add your own, it's still going to come with the heatsink and fan too, so you can take advantage of that as well. Putting it together is the same thing, you just kind of have to get the perfect angle here and then align everything up and then just screw it all back together. But before we do that, I do want to add a 2.5-inch SATA drive as well. This just kind of makes it easy for me when I'm doing my testing because I have all my Steam games already loaded on this, so I don't have to re-download them or anything. And it's pretty simple, the hookup's already there, you just would plug it right into the hard drive, and then you would want to screw the hard drive in place. Now one thing to note, the angle here doesn't work very well with my screwdriver, so what I had to do was seat the screw using my fingers and then just tighten it up at the end using the screwdriver. But after that, it was pretty easy to just put it all together. And also here's the second M.2 slot, so if you wanted to add another storage option right here, you could. So altogether, there are 3 different drives you could add to the bottom of this device. Okay, I think that's about it when it comes to the hardware. We'll get more into depth when we actually add the graphics card later on, but for now, let's turn it on and have a look. And as you can see, that little stripe here at the top is a blue LED light. I think it would have been really cool if this was RGB, like you could alter the colors or you could turn it off or things like that in the settings. But as it stands right now, it's just going to be on when you turn it on and off when you turn it off. And since it's on, let's go ahead and check out what's inside. So when you first turn it on, it is going to make you set up Windows 10 Pro, and that's just going to be your typical setup. Here's a quick look at the PC specs. As you can see, I have the Ryzen 7 5700G, 16 gigs of RAM, and Windows 10 Pro. Now the 5700G is about a $250 CPU altogether, with a base clock of 3.8 GHz up to 4.6 on turbo clock. According to the spec sheet, it should be between 45 and 65 watts for the configurable TDP. But let's also check that out ourselves, because MinisForum is actually really good at clocking their devices appropriately. And sure enough, if I run Prime 95 and do a torture test here, with a 100% load, it actually goes up to about 85 watts altogether. So you're getting a good 20 watts better performance than what the spec sheet says on the Ryzen page. And not only that, the temperature is staying at a stable 76-78 degrees Celsius altogether. And to me, that's a really great sign. The heatsink is working really well, the fan is nice and quiet, and they're getting great temperatures, and all at a TDP that's higher than the spec sheet. And so what that means to me is we're going to see some really great gaming performance. And so I think it's a good time now to jump into some PC gaming. As always, we're going to start out easy and then work our way up from there. In general, I'm running everything at a 1080p, and then I'm going to use default settings unless there is the ability to go to higher, and then I will choose higher. And right out of the gate, most of your typical low-end games, things like Celeste and Hades, they're all going to work great. In fact, Hades runs at about 175 frames per second. That's crazy. Moving up to Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I actually set it to high settings here, and we're getting a pretty stable 60 frames per second. There were some moments when it would dip down to say something like 40 frames per second just for a moment, but overall this was perfectly playable, and if you were just to put it on medium settings, it would be even better. For the Master Chief Collection, I'm going to use the medium settings, which are known as original settings in the game. Also running at 1080p, and I'm getting a solid 60 frames per second, no problem here. In fact, I have quite a bit of headroom, probably not enough to do high settings, but overall this is a really smooth experience. For Counter-Strike Go, I do like to put things on low settings here just for the best performance possible. And as you see here, we're getting about 150 frames per second altogether. So this will be really great for competitive shooters and things like Rocket League and all that other stuff. Okay, so let's keep pushing. We're going to do Tunic next. This one is surprisingly hard to play, but at low settings at 1080p, we're getting well over 60 frames per second. I just wish I was better at this game. And let's keep moving. Here is Doom Eternal at 1080p with low settings. And overall, we're getting over 60 frames per second. So this is going to be a really smooth gameplay experience. I think that medium settings would probably be a little bit too sluggish, but it looks and plays really well at low settings anyway. Here's Forza Horizon 5, 1080p low settings here as well, and we're getting an average of about 40, maybe 45 frames per second. So not quite 60 frames obviously, but it's still running really smooth and looks really nice even at low settings. This is definitely something I would enjoy playing. And so at the end of the day, I do think that some AAA games aren't going to play perfectly. For example, Street Fighter V actually can't get 60 frames per second on medium settings. And another good example would be Sea of Thieves. This one played at 720p with good 60 frames per second. But if I tried to push it up to 1080p, then I got an average of about 45 instead. So it's not going to play every game under the sun, but there are quite a few that are going to play really well, especially with integrated graphics. And I look forward to pushing this even further when I do add a graphics card to this mini PC in my next video. But for now, let's move over to emulation, and just like with PC gaming, we'll start out really low end and then work our way up from there. When it comes to your low-end systems, things like NES or Super Nintendo, absolutely no problem here. These games are going to play perfectly. And you're going to be able to throw any sort of filter or shader or any of those combinations at it. It's still going to run at 60 frames, no worries. Same thing with your handheld system, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, all that stuff's going to play just fine. But of course, you're not going to need a PC like that to play those games. Where you are going to see a difference, it's going to be things like Nintendo 64 and beyond. As you can see here, we're getting a solid 60 frames per second on Cruis'n USA, as well as Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So when it comes to Nintendo 64, this is going to be more than capable altogether. Same thing with Sega Dreamcast. As you see, I'm playing with a 1080p upscale with widescreen hacks enabled as well. And Dead or Alive 2 played fine, which is an indication to me that about 90% of Dreamcast games will play no problem. Now, I did detect a little bit of stuttering when it came to NBA 2K2. Every once in a while, it would dip down to something like maybe 56 frames per second. And it would be very quick and minor, but all the same, it would cause a tiny bit of audio stuttering, so I did want to bring that up. Now for PSP, we're going to use the standalone emulator here, also upscaled to 1080p, and as you can see, it's running like a dream. Outrun 2006 is one of the harder games to play on this system, same thing with Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier. So if it can play some of these heavy-hitting games, then I think most everything else will be just fine. And of course, here's my obligatory God of War Chains of Olympus. As you can see, 1080p, no problem. So altogether, I would say Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PSP, you can play all those at 1080p with no issues whatsoever. So let's keep going. Next, we're going to do Nintendo GameCube. We're also going to upscale this to 1080p, and it runs just great. Lower end games like Mario Kart Double Dash will have no problem whatsoever, and I was surprised to find that F-Zero GX also played at full speed as well. Generally, one of the hardest GameCube games to play is going to be Beyond Good and Evil, especially that first battle scene. It's very hard to stay at stable 60 frames per second. But surprisingly, this one does a pretty good job of that. It doesn't stay at 60 frames the entire time, but it stays at around 55 and beyond, which is actually really smooth gameplay. And of course, if I just downscale this to 720p, it would be completely smooth. Either way, this is probably some of the best GameCube I've seen on a standalone mini PC. Moving forward, let's keep it at 1080p, but move up to Nintendo Wii. And as you can see here, Mario Galaxy is playing at full speed, even during one of the busier moments, which is right here in the beginning. And using Tatsunoko vs. Capcom as another example, even in a level that has a lot of things going on in the background, or when using like the big moves and stuff, you just have some minor slowdowns, but overall it plays really well. So Nintendo Wii is going to be great on this too. Now let's move over to PS2. We'll start with some of the mid-range games like Grand Theft Auto 3 running at 60 frames, no problem. But if we move up to the higher end systems, even Ratchet & Clank is actually playing at a smooth 60 frames too. To me, this means that about 90% of games are going to play just fine, no problem. But of course, there's always an upper tier when it comes to PS2, and typically that's going to be something like God of War 2. This one actually started out really promising with 60 frames per second, but as I got further into this scene, I did see it dip down to like 55 and even down to like 51 or 52 as well. So I would say that God of War 2 is not going to be a perfect experience on the PS2 at 1080p, but you could definitely do it at 720p, no problem. Moving over to Xbox, for some reason both Halo 1 and 2 had some weird graphics things going on like this, and it may be because I had just updated the ZEMU emulator, but either way these two games didn't seem to work at all. But other games didn't have any problems. For example, Dead or Alive 3, I did a 2x resolution and it was a stable 60 frames. And surprisingly, same thing with Soul Calibur 2, and if this can play at a 2x resolution with 60 frames, that's a good indication that most other Xbox games will play really well, as long as they're compatible with the emulator. Okay, let's move up to Wii U next, and I actually upscaled this to 1080p because I found out that Mario Kart 8 could handle it at 720p no problem, and it turns out that 1080p worked really well too. And that's a really good sign. I would say that most games then would be able to play at least at native resolution, but many can probably play at 1080p as well. That's really awesome. Now, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD actually plays at a native 1080p, but as you can see, it's nice and smooth too. So in general, I would say that Wii U is going to be a great system for the B550, but for a benchmark, let's try Breath of the Wild. And on average, I got between 40 and 45 frames altogether. That obviously won't be quite as smooth as 60 frames per second, but it definitely feels a lot smoother than 30. And given the fact that it didn't ever go down to 30 or below, that means you're going to have a relatively smooth gameplay experience altogether. So things are working so well, I think we should keep going. Let's do PS3 next. Now I wanted to try God of War 2 HD just because the PS2 version wasn't great, but as you can see here it's running at 60 frames per second on the PS3 version anyway. So if you really wanted to play this game, I would play it on this emulator instead of the PS2 one. And I was surprised to find that most other PS3 games played just great. Dead or Alive 5, 60 frames per second, no problem. And my PS3 catalog isn't huge, but I did try out a couple other demos just to make sure. And yeah, as you can see here, Top Spin 4 is running at 60 frames, no problem as well. And surprisingly, Devil May Cry was at a stable 30 frames too. What's interesting is that I tested this game on a mini PC that cost more than this one, and that one could only average about 12 frames per second. So I think when it comes to emulation bang for your buck, I think the proof is in the pudding right here. Okay, two more standalone emulators here. Let's try 3DS next. Now this one did have some mixed performance. For the most part, the less demanding games, things like New Super Mario Bros. 2, no problem whatsoever. I was also surprised to find that Mario Kart 7 was relatively stable as well. Not quite 60 frames the entire time, but at least a smooth gameplay experience throughout the whole race. But it wasn't perfect. As you can see with the Link Between Worlds, the frame rate was all over the place. It would go from like 30 to 50, and it would speed up and slow down. It was kind of crazy. So 3DS is not perfect, but I would say maybe 75% of the catalog was good. And finally, let's try Nintendo Switch using the Yuzu emulator. I'm going to run everything at a native resolution here, but in docked mode. And surprisingly, a lot of these games ran at full speed. Super Mario 3D World, no problem. Same thing with Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. And so just these two games playing so smoothly is a good indication that about half of your catalog is going to play no problem. Mostly all of your 2D and indie games are going to be just fine. And surprisingly, a lot of the 3D games were good too. Super Mario Odyssey actually was at a relatively stable 60 frames per second as I was playing. Now it's probably going to dip down a little bit in some of the later levels, but altogether that's really promising. But unfortunately, Link's Awakening did not play at full speed even when adding in the frames per second hack. So this will be a good game to test when I actually add the graphics card to this PC and see if that improves things. So now let's test the Linux support of this mini PC. We're going to jump into the BIOS by pressing the delete key, and as you can see, the BIOS is kind of wide open. You can go in here and make all sorts of changes if you'd like. The only change I'm going to do is change the boot order priority, so that way it'll boot the Batocera USB drive that I've plugged in instead of the Windows drive. And then of course, if I want to get into Windows, all I have to do is just unplug that USB drive. So I'm going to save my configuration like this, and then I'm going to boot into Batocera instead. And I've done a lot of videos about Batocera in general, and it's one of my favorite gaming platforms to use. This is basically a dedicated Linux operating system made for retro gaming. So you could set this up using a thumb drive like I'm using here, or an SD card, or an additional hard drive. Either way, it's a pleasant experience to navigate through your games and then add your box art and all that other stuff. And so I'm going to do some quick testing here just to make sure everything works okay, but in all respects it seems to be performing really well. Your classic games are going to play just fine, same thing with some of your classic arcade games like Ninja Turtles or even Street Fighter the movie. And you can even push it up to something like Killer Instinct, it plays at a full 60 frames, no problem. And yeah, it would be totally overkill to use this as an arcade box, but all the same, it could be done. But either way, I still wanted to test some of the other systems. As you can see here, Nintendo 64 running at 1080p, no problem, even with Mario Tennis or GoldenEye 007, which are notoriously hard to maintain 60 frames per second with Nintendo 64. And I forgot to test it on the Windows side, but Sega Saturn plays just fine, so it'll be great on the Windows side as well as here on Batocera. And this is upscaled to 1080p and no problems here. Let's test a couple GameCube games while we're at it, and as you can see, Metroid Prime, no problem, 1080p. And same thing with NBA Street. These are both using the Vulkan backend, by the way. Moving up to Nintendo Wii, as you can see, Donkey Kong Country Returns, 60 frames per second, no problem. Overall, I would say the performance on Linux at this point is about equal to what you would find on Windows. And in some respects, I would say it's even a little bit better. For example, with Xbox here, we're running Halo 1, which didn't play very well on Windows at all, but here we're running it at a 2x resolution with no slowdown. Same thing with Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, 60 frames, no problem. But unfortunately, a common issue with Batocera is PS2. Because you only have the ability to tap into OpenGL or Vulkan, neither of those perform quite as well as DirectX on Windows. And so if you do want to play PS2, I would recommend sticking to the Windows side. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good indication of the performance you can expect on the B550 if you do happen to get it pre-built with the 5700G CPU. So let's talk about what I like and don't like about this device. In terms of what I like, I love the fact that this thing is so versatile. The fact that in addition to adding your own RAM and storage, you can add your own CPU is pretty cool. And then adding your own graphics card with a dock that comes with the device is just icing on the cake. I also appreciate the amount of storage options we have here, and the fact that this thing is expandable does make it built for longevity. You could upgrade it to a desktop CPU in the future, and of course you can add a graphics card and power supply as well. It has a good amount of ports and connectivity altogether, and the pre-built performance for this for $730 is kind of insane. I had to actively search out games that wouldn't work great because almost everything just played no problem. And finally, the fan is both quiet and pleasant to the ear. There's never really a moment where I actually noticed it. It just kind of is this nice, pleasant hum all the time. Now, of course, no device is perfect, so I have a couple things I want to nitpick about, and let's jump into that next. To start, I think the size here is kind of pushing it when you're talking about a mini PC. I think if this was the only mini PC you owned, you probably wouldn't even notice it. But for me, I've tested much smaller mini PCs, but of course nothing this powerful. I personally don't like the fact that it doesn't have front ports, and I get the fact that the power supply would probably cover it up once you have everything all docked together. But all the same, I would say probably 3/4 of people are not going to actually add a power supply and graphics card. And so in that regard, you're actually selling the device short for that majority of people. And finally, I wish that blue LED at the top of the device was configurable. I'd love to be able to change the color on it or turn it off if I'd like. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's my look at the MinisForum B550. And like I mentioned before, we'll do a different video here probably in another week or two, where I'm actually going to pull out the graphics card from my main PC and hook it up to this one. And I'm kind of excited to see what kind of performance we're going to get in that regard. But I gotta be honest, even without plugging in this graphics card, I'm already completely head over heels in love with this thing. I watched a couple other reviews of this device and they all were heaping a lot of praise on it. And honestly, I came in a little bit skeptical. You know, this thing promised to do a lot, but I wasn't really sure if it could. But it turns out that the CPU they ship with this is kind of amazing in the amount of performance it can do, especially when it comes to emulation. And so without even pushing this thing to its max potential, I'm already really impressed with it, and I think it definitely is worth the price. And given the fact that this thing is so versatile, I think that a lot of people are going to find different uses for it, and every single person's probably going to be pretty pleased with what they find. So thanks to MinisForum for sending out this prototype PC, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll leave a link in the video description if you want to check out more, but as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.